Most people build a Rolex wish list the way they browse Instagram. They see 10 thumbnails, they screenshot the ones that look expensive, and they call that a list. This wish list I am about to show you took 6 years. Every reference on it came from the realization where I understood something about watches I hadn't understood before. Let's go. Watch 10. Datejust 41, mint green, ref 126334. Most people dismiss the Datejust without looking at which version they're dismissing. The Datejust isn't a single watch, and the gap between the wrong configuration and the right one is wider than most buyers realize until they've done the research. The wrong version, in my opinion, is smooth bezel, oyster bracelet, standard dial. These trade below retail on the secondary market. Always have. The buyer pool is wide, but completely uncommitted. People who wanted a Rolex and took what was available, not people who understood what they were choosing. The watch I want is the one with the fluted bezel, Jubilee bracelet, mint green dial. 3 choices that change everything about the watch's position. The fluted bezel is 18-karat white gold on a watch retailing at around $9,600. So, you're receiving precious metal engineering at a price point most buyers associate entirely with steel. The fluting itself is a machining exercise. The precise, evenly spaced facets catch light at different angles depending on how the wrist moves, which gives the bezel a kinetic quality that a smooth or ceramic bezel doesn't produce. It's subtle in photographs. In person, at a table, in candlelight, you notice it constantly. The Jubilee bracelet costs more to produce than the oyster, and collectors who've paid attention to production quality recognize that immediately. The 5-link construction is different on the wrist. It is more relaxed, more dressy, and it was specifically designed by Rolex for the Datejust at the watch's 1945 debut. The combination of the Jubilee and the fluted bezel is the original Datejust configuration. You're not modernizing the watch by choosing those 2 elements. You're returning it to what it was always supposed to be. The mint green dial finishes the argument. It's become one of the most in-demand Rolex colors in the current catalog, not just within the Datejust family, but across all reference families. The shade is specific, not loud, not pale, but a green that reads as considered. Under certain lighting, it shifts toward teal. Under tungsten, it deepens. The interaction between that dial color and the white gold fluting produces a combination that's harder to describe than it is to recognize in person. Put those 3 choices together, and the watch trades consistently above retail. The plain Datejust trends below. One thoughtful decision separates 2 completely different outcomes. The deeper reason it opens this list is simpler than any of that. The Datejust is the first test an expert applies to themselves. Anyone who writes it off automatically hasn't looked closely enough. The person who spots the right combination and understands why it works has already reached a certain level of knowledge. I want this watch partly for what it is, and partly because wanting the right version of it means you see what most people miss. That's where this list begins. The Datejust is where the list starts. Number 9 is where the knowledge begins to show. Watch 9. Explorer 2 Polar Ref 226570. The Explorer 2 has a fixed steel bezel engraved with 24-hour markers, locked in position. Every other GMT in Rolex's current catalog has a rotating ceramic bezel. The Batman rotates. The Batgirl rotates. The Guinness rotates. The Explorer 2 does not, and that's not an oversight or a relic of older manufacturing. It's the reason this watch exists. The Explorer 2 was designed in the early 1970s for cave explorers and polar researchers who needed an unambiguous, permanent reference point to distinguish day from night in conditions where no natural light existed. The fixed bezel is the feature. The 24-hour scale doesn't need to rotate because the watch was built for situations where the reference point has to be reliable, not adjustable. There's a discipline in that decision that I find compelling. Most watches try to do more as they develop. More complications, more functions, more rotatable elements. The Explorer 2 added the fixed bezel as a feature and then defended it across 50 years of production against every pressure to make it more like everything else. That's rare. Most objects compromise under the pressure of market adjacency. This one didn't. When I look at the white dial variant, the Polar, I'm looking at a watch where every design decision traces back to a specific human need. The contrast between the white dial, the black hands, and the black outlines around the applied indices produces one of the highest legibility configurations in Rolex's current production. You can read the time in a dimly lit room at arm's length. In a watch that costs this much money, that should be a given. It's not always a given. Here, it's definitional. The Explorer family carries one of the most direct origin stories in the catalog. The Ref 6098, submitted for the 1953 Everest ascent. The Explorer 2 arriving for the underground explorers who needed something the original couldn't provide. Every generation of this watch has inherited both stories. The 226570 is the current form of that inheritance, and the white dial tells it more directly than the black. Gray market sits between $9,500 and $11,000 near retail. No meaningful hype premium. You're paying for the object on its own terms, which is the right way to pay for anything worth keeping. Function over fashion. That's the Explorer 2. Number 8 is where the daily wear question gets interesting. Watch 8. GMT Master 2 Guinness Ref 126710 GRNR. Let me tell you what I don't want from a daily watch. I don't want something that makes me think about its price every time I put it on. I don't want a reference so loaded with secondary market mythology that every scratch feels like a financial event. And I don't want a watch whose cultural weight as a status object arrives before its design does. The Guinness, the black and gray-green GMT that arrived in 2023, avoids all of that. It's the GMT I'd wear to a client meeting and not think about. Then put on a boat and not think about. Then wear to dinner and still not think about. A watch that disappears into daily life while remaining excellent is one of the harder things to find in this catalog, and the Guinness is it. The color palette is the reason. Black and gray-green is a combination that reads as neither sporty nor formal, but somewhere in the middle, which means it actually works in both places. The dial is clean. The bezel is low contrast enough that it doesn't dominate. Put it under a shirt cuff, and it reads as presence without spectacle. Under the caseback is caliber 3285. 70 hours of power reserve, chromolite lume, plus or minus 2 seconds per day, under the superlative chronometer standard. This is the same movement running every steel GMT Master 2 in the current lineup. The case is the same, the bracelet options are identical, the specifications are shared across the family. What differs between the GMT references is tone. And tone is what a serious daily wearer is actually choosing between when the mechanical specs are matched. The secondary market sits around $19,000 to $21,000 for a full set. The premium is moderate compared to the hype-driven GMT references. That's not a flaw in the watch. It's a feature of choosing a reference for the right reasons rather than for what the market has decided about it this quarter. Here's the observation about daily wear watches that most collecting discourse skips. The watches that disappear into a life are harder to build a collection around than the watches that make a point of showing up. It's easier to buy a statement than to buy something that works. The Guinness works. The person who's been wearing the same watch for 5 years without once feeling the need to upgrade it has found the right daily watch. This reference has that quality. Most in the GMT family don't, because they carry too much mythology to wear quietly. The daily driver answer. Number 7 is the one I keep returning to every time I think the list is settled. Watch 7, Explorer 36 Ref 124270. In May 1953, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay summited Everest. The expedition was equipped with the Ref 6098, a large case Rolex prototype that Rolex had been testing in high altitude conditions since 1952. The Ref 6098 never carried the Explorer name on its dial. That distinction belongs to the Ref, the 6350, released later in 1953, as the first Rolex bearing Explorer in print. But the 6098 is the direct ancestor. It proved what Rolex needed to prove, and the Explorer family grew from what it survived. The 124270, which returned to 36mm in 2021 after a decade at 39mm, is the current form of that argument. The gray market trades this reference at around $7,000, close to retail, no meaningful premium. I know how that reads to people who've absorbed the idea that secondary market markup equals quality validation. So let me offer a different framework. A watch with no hype baked into its price is a watch you're paying for entirely on its own terms. Every other reference on this list carries some premium above retail, some allocation drama, some speculative layer woven into the transaction. The Explorer 36 doesn't. You're buying caliber 3,230 70 hours of power reserve, chromalite lume, a case refined across 7 decades, and a design that passed the hardest test any object faces. Sustained use in extreme conditions, repeated over generations, without ever requiring a fundamental redesign. The collectors who wear the Explorer 36 are not the ones who couldn't afford something else. They looked at everything else and came back to this. That's a different kind of preference, and it takes longer to arrive at than picking the watch with the highest secondary market premium. I keep moving this reference up and down the list, and it keeps resisting both moves. It wants to sit somewhere in the middle, where the quiet watches live, where the knowledge is, not the noise. And there's a question I ask about every watch before it makes this list. Would I still want it if I couldn't tell anyone the price? The Explorer 36 is the one where the answer is fastest. Yes, without hesitation. Because the value isn't in the number. It's in the 70 years of answered questions sitting inside the case. The Explorer 36 resists every attempt to move it off the list. Number 6 is where the material conversation shifts completely. Watch 6, Day Date 40 Platinum Ice Blue, Ref 228236. Here's something Rolex never announced, and most buyers still don't know. For decades, if you wanted a platinum day date, you had to accept a smooth bezel. Not because Rolex chose smooth, because machining the sharp, repeated facets of a fluted bezel into platinum at production scale produced rejection rates that made it commercially unworkable. Platinum is denser than gold and resists fine machining at high tolerances. So platinum day dates arrived with smooth bezels, and the fluted look stayed in gold. Collectors who wanted platinum had to accept a different aesthetic than what the watch originally promised. Then Rolex solved the machining problem and said nothing about it. The 228236 arrived with a solid platinum fluted bezel, the first time that specific combination existed in the brand's history. And they paired it with the ice blue dial, a color Rolex uses exclusively on platinum references. Not white gold, not yellow gold, platinum only. If you see an ice blue Rolex dial from across a room, you already know what the case is made from before you've read a single word. That's communication through material rather than through marking or labeling. The watch tells you what it is by what it is. That's an extremely precise form of luxury, and it's one that requires knowledge to receive. The person who doesn't recognize the ice blue dial sees a blue watch. The person who does recognize it understands the entire conversation the object is having. I'm not going to pretend the price isn't serious. Retail runs between $75,000 and $80,000. Gold day dates can soften on the secondary market because the buyer pool is wide and the supply is less constrained than sports references. Platinum runs a different calculation. The ice blue dial attracts a narrow but committed buyer pool. These don't appear at distressed prices. When they move at or near what was paid. This watch has been on every version of this list since I first understood what it was. That's not changing. Some watches earn their place by being excellent. This one earns it by being specific. It exists because a manufacturing problem was solved, and no announcement was made, because the object was considered sufficient. I find that kind of confidence compelling in ways I don't fully know how to articulate. Platinum is the ceiling in material terms. Number 5 is where the argument gets more interesting, not less expensive. Watch 5. Submariner, no date, ref 124060. Removing the date window from a Submariner is an act of editing. It sounds reductive, but editing is what separates craft from accumulation. The date Submariner is an excellent watch. The no date is the same watch with one element removed, and the effect on the dial is significant and immediate once you know to look for it. Without the date window cutting into the lower right quadrant, without the Cyclops lens sitting above it, the dial achieves a radial symmetry that the date model can't reach. The Mercedes hand and the applied indices sit in perfect balance across the full face. The case, bezel, and dial exist as concentric circles with nothing interrupting the geometry. It reads as complete. In a way, the date model, for all its excellence, doesn't quite achieve. That symmetry isn't decorative. It's the original argument of the watch. The first Submariners had no date. The date complication arrived as a commercial addition, not a design decision. The no-date ref 124060 is the version of the Submariner that says, "We know what this watch was supposed to be." The movement is caliber 3230. The date model runs 3235. Both use the Chronergy escapement, both run 70 hours of power reserve, both meet the superlative chronometer standard of plus or minus 2 seconds per day. The 3230 is the simpler construction. In a tool watch with a service life measured in decades, that simplicity isn't a neutral fact. Fewer mechanisms, fewer intervention points across 30 to 40 years of wear. Gray market sits at $10,000 to $12,000, a mild premium over the retail of $9,300. The buyer population for this reference is almost entirely deliberate. These aren't people who received a no date because the date model was out of stock. They compared both versions, held the choice for a while, and chose the cleaner dial. Watches that attract only deliberate buyers hold value quietly. That's a consistent pattern in this market, and this reference demonstrates it. There's something I've noticed about people who own this specific reference. They can tell you exactly why they have it. Not the price, not the allocation story. The specific thing they saw when they compared both dials that settled the decision. That specificity is what makes a collection rather than an inventory. The no date attracts those buyers because the watch itself required that kind of attention to choose correctly. Deliberate restraint. Number 4 is where Rolex stopped being conservative and did something they'd never done before. Watch 4, Land Dweller 40 White Rolzor, ref 127334. At Watches and Wonders 2025, Rolex released a watch built on 16 patents and an entirely new escapement that hadn't existed before that morning. Let me be specific, because casual coverage of the Land Dweller spent too much time on the integrated bracelet and the honeycomb dial, and not nearly enough time on what's happening inside the case. The caliber 7135 is the first high-frequency movement Rolex has produced at scale in the brand's history. It beats at 5 Hz, 36,000 vibrations per hour. Every other Rolex currently in production beats at 4 Hz. That 1 additional hertz is the difference between a movement that measures time to 1/4 of a second and one that measures it to 1/10. The Dynapulse escapement that makes this possible is entirely silicon and operates as a double-wheel indirect impulse system. It's 30% more efficient than a conventional Swiss lever escapement, which is why a 5 Hz movement can achieve 66 hours of power reserve while running thinner than most existing Rolex calibers. Rolex developed it over 10 years. 7 patents cover the escapement alone. The Swiss lever escapement has been the standard in mechanical watchmaking since the 19th century. The Dynapulse doesn't replace it in the rest of the Rolex catalog, but it exists now, in serial production, at a retail price of $15,500 for the Rolesaur version. That's what makes this watch a collector's object. Not the dial, not the bracelet, not the design language that traces back to the oyster quartz of the 1970s. The dial divides collectors. The honeycomb texture and the Arabic numerals at 6 and 9 generate strong reactions. People either see something modern and intentional or something that doesn't look like a Rolex. That division is the gap an expert buyer can step into. While some people are making up their minds from a photograph, the movement inside the case is the most significant engineering event in Rolex's recent history. Secondary market for the 40mm, white Rolesaur sits between $30,000 and $36,000 against retail of around $15,500. The premium is real, and it reflects genuine collector demand for the first-year production of a new collection with a historically significant movement. Whether those premiums sustain long-term depends on how Rolex expands the collection. But the caliber 7135 isn't going anywhere. I have a complicated relationship with the dial. I don't have a complicated relationship with the movement. caliber 7135 is the reason. Number 3 is the watch I'd struggle most to explain to someone who doesn't already read Rolex deeply, but the explanation is the most interesting one on this list. Watch 3, Sky Dweller Steel Blue Dial, Ref 336934. Most people who wear a Sky Dweller can't explain how it works. That's not a criticism, it's context. The ring command bezel is unintuitive until you understand it, and once you understand it, it becomes one of the cleverest interface decisions in current watchmaking. Rotating the outer bezel to 3 distinct positions changes what the crown controls. One position for local time, one for the annual calendar, one for the home time zone. All of it runs through a single crown with no additional pushers or second crown. The bezel tells the crown what it's doing before you touch it. This mechanism took years to develop and generate multiple patents. It solves a real problem. Grand complications require complex interfaces, and complex interfaces mean more points of potential user error or mechanical stress. Rolex built a mechanism that simplifies the interface by using the bezel as a selector, rather than adding more crown positions or external pushers. That's elegant engineering, not marketing. The annual calendar inside, which Rolex calls the Saros system, requires one correction per year in March to account for February's short month. 11 months out of 12, it corrects itself. The caliber 9002, updated in 2023 from the previous 9001 with the chronergy escapement and improved magnetic resistance, is the only Rolex movement built to run this complication. It exists in no other reference in the catalog. One thing to understand before buying: every Sky Dweller has an 18-karat gold bezel. Every single one, regardless of case material. The 336934, often marketed as the Steel Sky Dweller, has a white gold ring command bezel because the mechanism requires the bezel to interface with the case at tolerances that steel alone doesn't hold reliably across temperature variation. So, the entry into this watch includes precious metal engineering at the load-bearing, functional component. You're not avoiding gold, you're getting it where it matters most. Blue dial on the gray market runs between $26,000 and $34,000 for a full set against retail of $17,750. The mint green is the most sought-after current configuration in 2026. I want the blue, not because of what the data says, because I've held both in person, and the blue dial, at 42 millimeters on the Jubilee bracelet, has a depth of color that product renders don't capture. It looks different in person. That specific quality is what makes a watch worth the decision. The Sky Dweller rewards knowledge. Number 2 rewards a different kind of understanding, the one that comes from knowing what Rolex built in 1963 and what it still means. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. You walk into a store or browse online, and everything looks the same, but behind the scenes, there's a system. Prices aren't always fair, availability is controlled, and one bad decision can leave you overpaying for something that doesn't even hold its value. That's why I created a complete free insider guide to buying watches. Inside, you'll find the best watches to buy, the watches to avoid, and how to choose a watch that actually fits your style and budget long term. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the free guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. Watch 2, a detour, then the Daytona. Cosmograph Daytona Panda, Ref 126500LN. I need to acknowledge something before this entry. The Sky Dweller and the Daytona have been swapping positions on this list for 2 years. Every time I think I've settled it, I reconsider. So, here's the honest version. The Sky Dweller is number 3 because the Daytona asks a question I can't stop thinking about, and that question feels closer to the truth of why I collect watches. In March 2023, to mark 60 years of the Daytona, Rolex replaced the 116500LN with the 126500LN. The changes were measured, case thinned, to 11.9 millimeters, lugs refined for more symmetrical proportions, a steel ring added around the ceramic bezel insert, and the movement updated from caliber 4,130 to caliber 4,131 with a new generation vertical clutch and column wheel. The result is a chronograph that engages with no pre-travel in the pushers. The click before the chronograph starts is definitive. There's no ambiguity in the mechanism, no gap between intention and execution. Let me say something about the caliber 4,131 that doesn't get enough attention. The 4,130 that preceded it was already considered one of the finest integrated chronograph movements in production. Rolex builds the 4,131 from scratch at their own manufactory. The column wheel and vertical clutch combination is the architecture serious watchmakers prefer for sports chronographs because it produces more consistent contact between the driving and driven mechanisms. The vertical clutch means there's no lateral force on the chronograph wheel when the pusher is pressed, which is what produces that clean click with no jump in the second hand. That smoothness isn't cosmetic. It's the difference between a precise instrument and a loud one. The White Panda dial hasn't traded below retail since the first examples hit the gray market in late 2023. Unworn 2026 dated full sets are listing at $38,000 to $39,000 against a retail of $16,900. But here's what I actually think about when I think about this watch. The Daytona is the only reference on this list where the original function and the cultural weight arrived in the same direction. The Submariner is a tool watch that became a luxury object. The GMT Master is a pilot's instrument that became a status symbol. The Daytona was built to time a race, and that function has never left it. The subdials, the pushers, the tachymeter scale, these aren't decorative relics. They're what the watch was made to do. The fact that it became one of the most coveted objects in the collecting world happened around the function, not instead of it. In the early 1960s, when Rolex first started producing the Cosmograph, it launched in 1963 as the Ref 6239, without the Daytona name on the dial at all. The dial simply read Cosmograph. It wasn't until 1964 that Daytona started appearing on production dials, named after Daytona International Speedway, where Rolex had become the official timekeeper in 1962. So, the connection between the watch and the track was real and earned, before the name ever appeared on the dial. And then, slowly, collectors started to understand what they'd been ignoring. The Paul Newman Daytona, the exotic dial reference now selling at auction for hundreds of thousands, was a watch that went unsold in its original retail context. That history sits inside the current reference. I held the 126500LN once in Geneva. The pushers had a mechanical feedback I've only felt on movements costing significantly more. The dial was brighter in person than it reads anywhere online. The weight was lighter than I expected. That's the thing about the Daytona. It gives you something you didn't anticipate. Number one does the same thing in a different way. The Daytona is the watch where everything arrives at once. Number one is the one I didn't see coming until I did. Watch 1, Sky Dweller. I moved the Sky Dweller to number 3 and spent 2 years defending that decision. I'm not defending it anymore. Here's what I couldn't answer when the Daytona was at number 1. If I could only keep one watch from this list forever, which one would it be? Not the most famous one, not the highest premium, not the most photographed or discussed or coveted. The one that, on every wrist day for the next 30 years, I'd be most glad is there. The answer is the Sky Dweller. Because the Daytona is extraordinary, but it's a chronograph, a complication I activate on purpose, in a specific context when I need it. The Sky Dweller is always doing something. The annual calendar is running. The dual time zone is tracking a city I care about. The ring command bezel is sitting in one of its 3 positions, telling the crown what it's ready to do. The watch is permanently engaged in something beyond simply telling the time, and I find that deeply satisfying on a daily basis. In a way, the Daytona's chronograph isn't, because the chronograph requires me to decide to use it, while the Sky Dweller is already working, whether I engage with it or not. There's a psychological dimension here that I think matters for collecting. Some watches are best experienced actively. You reach for a chronograph when you need a chronograph. The moment of pressing the pusher is the point. The Sky Dweller asks nothing of you except attention. And what it offers in return is the sense that time is being organized in two cities simultaneously, on a calendar that corrects itself through a mechanism that arrived after years of engineering. You don't have to activate it to receive that. It's happening on your wrist, whether you're watching or not. An annual calendar paired with a dual time zone display, controlled through a mechanism built across years and multiple patents in a white gold and steel case at roughly $18,000 retail. That complication package in any other Swiss manufacturer approaches $50,000 or above. Rolex built it, put it in a sports-adjacent case, and priced it where they price GMT Master 2s. The reason most people don't buy it isn't because they looked and decided against it. It's because they looked at the name and the case shape, assumed sports watch, and moved to the sports watch section of the catalog. The blue dial on the Jubilee bracelet at 42mm is the configuration I want. The size suits the complication. The Jubilee's dressier construction matches what the watch is asking you to do, which is organize your time across locations, not dive to 300 meters. The blue dial has a depth of color that product renders consistently underrepresent. At a desk, in direct light, it reads as a different shade than it does in low light. The watch is doing something visually, depending on where you wear it, which is not a quality that appears in specifications. After 6 years of building this list, that's the watch I trust the most, not because of what it signals, because of what it does. A wish list built on what everyone else wants is just a mirror pointed at the market. The watches that last on a list like this aren't the ones with the most hype or the highest secondary market floors. They're the ones you can still explain at the end of a long conversation, when all the justifications have been stripped away and only the honest reason remains. The reason you'd give to someone who doesn't care about collecting, who just wants to know why you kept this one over everything else. Every reference on this list has one of those reasons. The date just, because configuration is the whole argument and most people skip it. The Explorer 2, because function never lied to anybody. The Guinness, because daily use requires a watch that disappears without disappearing. The Explorer 36, because restraint is an advanced position. The Day Date, because platinum speaks quietly and correctly. The No Date Submariner, because editing is craft. The Land Dweller, because the caliber 7135 is a horological event wearing an integrated bracelet. The Daytona, because the function and the legend arrived in the same direction. The Sky Dweller, because nothing adjacent to it does what it does at this price point. That's the list. 6 years of revision, in just under 900 words of closing. Drop your own list in the comments. Like and subscribe.